Well, hello everyone, and today we're doing not exactly a monthly wrap up, more just talking about some books that I read recently that I wanted to chat about and put some of my thoughts out there. And so we're going to start with the first one. I've read this a little bit of a while ago, but still want to talk about it. This is The Power That Preserves by Stephen R. Donaldson. This is book three in the first chronicle of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. This is the story, obviously, if you've been following along with these. This is about Thomas Covenant, who's an author in our world who contracts leprosy, finds himself swept away into a fantasy world where he is the prophesied hero who's going to defeat the Dark Lord, Lord Fowl. But yet, Thomas Covenant does not believe that this fantasy world is real. He thinks it's just a hallucination, and there's just enough plausible deniability that's presented in these books to kind of give him the edge out of, like, well, maybe it is all in his head. Maybe it is all nonsense. This third book, The Power That Preserves, I think is probably my favorite of the trilogy. Book one, Lord Fowl's Bane, I thought had a lot of interesting things in it. Book two, I actually wasn't as hot on as the other fellows that I was reading this with. I've been reading it with Jake from Nerd Level Rising, and then, of course, my friend Zachary Shea as well, who's another booktuber. And both of them liked the Ill-Earth War, book two, quite a bit. I thought it was just okay. The Power That Preserves, though, I think is pretty solidly the best of the three Thomas Covenant books. And this is for a couple of reasons, right? So one is there's this problem that Thomas Covenant is a very unlikable character in a lot of ways. So Stephen Donaldson is dealing with this dichotomy, this tension that other authors like Gene Wolfe and R. Scott Baker, we'll be talking about both of them later in this wrap-up, have also dealt with, where you have this tension within one character of being a savior, but also being a depraved sinner as well. So for Thomas Covenant, these books sometimes get labeled as grimdark, even though there's nothing grimdark about them, except that Thomas Covenant, just brief spoiler warning for the setup of book one, rapes someone near the beginning of book one. And this is not done in a graphic or voyeuristic way, and yet, for what would be otherwise a heroic fantasy series, this moment is shocking and very disturbing, understandably, for a lot of people. This is our prophesied hero, ladies and gentlemen, an assaulter, a rapist, a man who can barely be forgiven by those around him for what he's done, and a man who certainly cannot forgive himself for his own crimes. So Donaldson plays with some interesting things. There's some very obvious, on-the-nose, like C.S. Lewis level allegories for, like, oh, Jesus symbolism around Thomas Covenant. Now, none of that bothers me, because I think what Donaldson is doing here is interesting. Here's the main hiccup that keeps this series from being a favorite of mine. I enjoyed reading it on the whole. I'm glad I read it. I think it is a very important piece of fantasy history, but I don't think it's going to be a favorite of mine. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is, I think that almost all of the side characters that are noble and heroic are utterly boring. Not all, but most of them. Many of them I can't even remember their names. Many of the lords and barons who are lesser characters in this series. And I think that is something that we'll talk about later in this wrap-up. I think it takes a truly skilled author to be able to make goodness and virtue interesting in a story. It is very easy to make evil, to make morally gray characters sexy and interesting and fascinating and brooding, but in real life, evil is stupid and pointless and ridiculous. You think of how asinine the idea of a murderer is versus somebody who's truly heroic, somebody who's truly self-sacrificing. Think of a Gandhi or a Mother Teresa, as sort of those archetypes. That's actually truly heroic. That is truly exciting. That's truly worth looking up to and reading about. And it takes a lot of skill as an author to capture that. And I think Donaldson really struggles to make his heroic characters interesting. So that's one problem. The second problem is that Donaldson is writing fantasy to a scale that is equivalent with Tolkien in terms of his efforts, which is different lands and worlds and cultures and all these things. And yet, the messages that he's trying to communicate are not theological, like many of Tolkien's messages can be. They're much more dealing with psychological things. So think of like how Ursula K. Le Guin deals with a lot of Jungian archetypes, and in her Earthsea books, her Wizard of Earthsea books. Honestly, Donaldson is doing something pretty similar here. This is why we have very on-the-nose names. The main character is Thomas Covenant. One of the main henchmen of the main villain is named Drool Rotworm. It's like, okay, very subtle there. Some of the main protectors of Thomas Covenant and his companions are called the Bloodguard. The main villain of the series is called Lord Fowl. This is not exactly subtle, what Donaldson is doing here. And for somebody like Le Guin, this actually works quite well in terms of the books that she's writing. I haven't read as much Le Guin as maybe some others have, so maybe I'm being a bit presumptuous or preemptive in saying that. But from what I've read, it works pretty well. Whereas with Donaldson here, the gimmick doesn't work quite as well when you're trying to tell a story that's like epic fantasy, right? Because there's a lot of time spent on world building that I just found to be pretty uninteresting compared to how interested Donaldson was in it. And that's just a personal preference thing. For the people who say, I'm a theme first reader, I want to know what are the true deep themes that are being explored in this story. Well, here's Exhibit A. If you're like, I'm theme above plot and characters, read Thomas Covenant. This is like all themes, no plot, really. That's not actually true. But this is all theme idea, philosophy-driven fantasy novels for people who are like, I want to read, Malazan or Second Apocalypse for the philosophy. Try Stephen Donaldson, because there's a lot of interesting things that he explores here, even though maybe the characters or the plot aren't as compelling as a lot of modern characters and plots are. I will say, it is interesting to me that these get categorized as grimdark, even though I've said they really aren't, because in the same way that Dostoevsky is able to predict a lot of the philosophies, the Übermensch philosophies of Nietzsche, before Nietzsche has even taught them, but he's able to predict and refute them in, say, a work like Crime and Punishment. Donaldson is a skilled enough author that he does a similar thing here. He predicts a lot of the nihilism and even the existentialism that a lot of modern grimdark presents itself with, and gives a counterexample. And, remarkably, gives a counterexample without being religious. Because most counterexamples that are presented come from an explicitly theological or theist worldview. Which, like, I personally share. I have no issue with. But that's how a lot of counterexamples are presented. And Donaldson, I think, from what I've read, provides one of the better cases for meaning and purpose and a rejection of both nihilism and existentialism without resorting to, because God created us. Without having that be the foundation of what he's of what he's writing about. There's some really interesting things done, especially in this book, when it comes to creation, the purpose behind if we were made, if we evolved. And that's going to work much better for some people than it will for others. For people who are looking for a theistic answer, hey, like, Thomas Covenant might not be the series for you, but I think there are at least interesting ideas to explore. And I think that this one, The Power That Preserves, has the most interesting plot of the three. So, yeah, I'm glad I read these. I'm not sure yet if I want to read the sequel trilogies. I've heard mixed things about the sequel series, but I'm at least glad that I read this one. The next book that we're going to be talking about is something that's a little bit different, and that is because it's not a fantasy or sci-fi novel, which is a lot of what I talk about here. This is a mystery novel. This is A Woman Underground by Andrew Klavan. Klavan is an author I've not spoken about a lot on this channel, and that's mainly because I did most of my reading of Andrew Klavan before I started BookTube. But I've read, like, almost every novel that this guy's written. I love his thrillers and crime novels, and this most recent series that he's working through, this is the one that came out last year, is called the Cameron Winter series. And in brief, the Cameron Winter books are about Cameron Winter is an English professor, but when he was a young man, he was an assassin for the United States government. And so what makes these books stand out as mystery novels and what makes them work so well is because we get this juxtaposition between Cameron Winter talking to, of all things, his therapist and working through some of the traumatic things that he experienced, some of the potentially horrific things that he did while in service to his nation as an assassin. And at the same time, we see him working through often very modern problems. This book deals with like AI in some substantial ways, and then also some of the real political unrest that we experience now, in some interesting ways. Dealing with those problems through the context of like a mystery that's happened. So in this one, he's searching for a missing person, a missing woman, while using those skills that he learned while being an assassin. So it makes for a really interesting comparison. This series really is a lot about Cameron Winter searching for meaning, especially in the modern world when he has such a respect and regard for many of these romantic poets and thinkers of yesteryear, and the way that they processed the world and the way that they talked about the world and their beliefs about it, and him trying to reconcile that with the very secular world he finds himself living in, and the secular worldview that he himself has. So if you want, I don't know, if I say elevated mystery, then it makes it sound snobbish, which it really isn't. But if you want mystery novels that really will give you something to chew on, that really have a lot of depth to them, they're not surface level at all. The Cameron Winter books are good. This one specifically, A Woman Underground, ties up some threads that were left open in the first few books in this series. So this is the fourth, and we're really doing a lot of closing off threads that were opened in book one, specifically regarding to Cameron Winter's past, and the things that he experienced when he was a young man, and some of the ways that his heart was broken, and can he move on from that. So overall, this is a very, very good novel. The Cameron Winter books are some of Klaven's best, and they're a great place to start with reading his stuff. This one is darker than the other three. And it's not because there's like graphic, violent things that happen. These are actually some of the, in terms of objectionable content, these are some of the tamer books that Klaven has written. But this one is just a very heavy book. It can feel really depressing at times. But overall, I really enjoyed it. Thoroughly enjoyed it. The next book that we're going to be talking about is The Devil in a Forest by Gene Wolfe. So this was a buddy read along with my good friend Jay at the channel Contemplative Reader. We both are big fans of Wolfe and wanted to read a Wolfe book together, and so we picked this. This is one of Wolfe's early novels, and it is advertised, it's published by Ace Science Fiction, and it's advertised as a fantasy novel. It really is nothing of the sort. It is much more a historical fiction novel. It reminds me in a lot of ways, and this is something that I said in my conversation with Jay, which I won't talk a whole lot about this. Check out our conversation if you want to hear more about it. It reminded me in a lot of ways of like a Robert Eggers movie. So think like The Lighthouse, The Witch, where you've got this highly atmospheric, slowly like brooding sense of horror throughout the story. The Northman. There's a lot of that here. It's about a small medieval village, like a village of like under 10 people, where there's a bandit that lives in the forest. Devil in a forest, right? Who keeps killing people who try to approach the village. And they decide they're going to do something about it. Do they call in the militia? Do they start up a band of, like a posse themselves and hunt down this rogue that's in the forest? And the young man, Mark, the main character, has an unexpected encounter with this bandit and finds himself caught in sort of the crossfire of this conflict. So this book is an early example of Wolfe working through some of the ideas that he'll explore more in his later books, especially in the Book of the New Sun. You get that a lot with this bandit versus Mark. Similar vibe to like Severian and Vodalus in Book of the New Sun. Overall, this one's not as confusing as some of Wolfe's other books, but I also didn't find it as gripping, which is fine. Like, not every book needs to be a home run. But in terms of my personal preference, there's a good argument to be made that this is my least favorite Wolfe book that I've read so far. So, a good book. I recommend it if you're interested in it, but I wouldn't recommend it as your first Wolfe book. And the next book that I read that we'll talk about here is, this last month, I reread A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller. This is one of my favorite sci-fi novels. I really, really enjoyed this novel, even more on a reread. I got to have a conversation about this book with the booktuber Andy Smith, and so we had a whole conversation about that that I'll link below here. So if you're interested, I recommend checking that out. This is, like I said, it's one of my favorite sci-fi novels, and I wanted to reread it, one, to prep myself for that conversation, but also I think I'm going to do a longer form video on it. and just talk about what I think Walter Miller does that has made this book endure, why I think it's so significant, and some of the religious things that he plays with in this book, I found to be very fascinating. And there are some things that are also maybe anti-religious in this book that I also found interesting. So anyway, I won't go over it a whole lot more here, other than to say read it and reread it and really enjoyed it. And I don't usually reread things like back to back like that. So hey, you know that I liked it. Actually, sorry, Jordan. I reread the Anubis Gates then here in November. So that's another example of me like rereading something that I read relatively recently just because I enjoyed it that much. One other book that I read that I'm not going to talk about a whole lot here is I did get the chance to read Shogun by James Clavell. I've been reading this alongside my friend Chris with the channel The Bearded Book Beast, and I think our plan is to have a longer form discussion about this at some point. So I'm going to save most of my thoughts for then, other than to say I felt like it was hard to get attached to a lot of the characters. So from character work standpoint, I wasn't terribly impressed by it, except for the main trio of characters, which is Blackthorn, Toranaga, and Mariko. But obviously, the examination of Imperial Japan and the culture at that time, and just giving it a full, honest expression of what this culture looked like, and the clash of that, and then these, what are they? Is he an English pirate? I'm trying to remember. Is the best part of the book. That cultural clash is why it's worth the read. So I've heard some people say that, like, oh, Shogun doesn't have a wasted page. It's so good. I didn't feel that way. I felt like it was a bit overly long at times, but still glad I read it, and I still think it's worth people's time if they want to see what a completely different time and place, and people who have a very different worldview from 2025 America, what that looks like. Shogun is a great book to have that. And sort of the perfect example of this is you'll hear a lot of people who will say, well, everybody kind of knows that this is right and this is wrong. Well, we all kind of had these different points of view, and, don't all, people in the past probably wouldn't really do that because their justification is like, I could never see myself doing, XYZ thing. And Shogun is a great example of a culture that is so detached from ours now, and how they thought about things and processed things, and how they reasoned to them being right and just, and things that we now look at as being like horrific or barbaric, and yet that there are other parts of the culture that are very admirable and should be respected. And Clavell does a very good job showing all of this without passing judgment, without saying like, oh, and this is why the English sailors are better. Oh, this is why the samurai are so much better than those darn dirty English. So, yeah, a really fantastic book in a lot of ways, and I see why it's a classic. So overall, I would say, I read Pillars of the Earth recently, and I think that one probably works better for me. If for no other reason than it was just a little easier to follow. The names are less foreign to me, so they stuck a little easier. And maybe I found the characters in Pillars more memorable. But thoroughly enjoyed both of them. Another book, and this one is probably my book of the month, if I'm being totally honest. I wasn't planning on reading this in October, and I wasn't planning on reading a ton of stuff that's like on brand, spooky season. But I bit the bullet because I saw other people reading this, and I didn't want to feel left out. So I read Fevre Dream by George R.R. Martin. This is his steamboat vampire novel. This is about a steamboat captain named Abner Marsh who is down on his luck. His fleet of steamboats has been destroyed by natural disasters, and a man named Joshua York approaches him and says, hey, I will fund your dream steamboat project. You can build the biggest, most beautiful steamboat you ever want. The only condition is you have to take me along with you and not question like anything I do ever, or any of the guests that I bring on board. And some people might consider this a spoiler. I saw it as being very obvious from like page 2 that Joshua York is a vampire. And so it's a vampire novel from there, and about this friendship, love-hate relationship, turning enemy potentially, maybe, who knows, relationship between Abner Marsh and Joshua York. And it is just incredible. George Martin's character work, as always, is top-notch. If you're a fan of the movie Sinners that came out earlier this year, which is sort of like Southern Gothic mixed with like exploitation movie vampire story, Fevre Dream is something you should definitely check out because it is very much like Southern Gothic in a certain way. It feels like Mark Twain meets Bram Stoker. So like the Mark Twain Life on the Mississippi type of thing. So overall, I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was very well done. I'm very picky about the portrayal of vampires in media. So something like the recent Nosferatu movie, there's elements of how they did vampires that I just loved, and then there are elements of it that made me so mad I wanted to like throw my phone across the room. Um, but then you've got movies like Sinners, where it's like this is not my particular preference of like exact pickiness of how I look at of how I prefer vampires being represented in movies or books, but it's a well done story. It's a heck of a lot of fun. There's a lot of great other elements to it, and so because of that, I'll kind of give it a pass. And in a similar way, Fever Dream, George Martin does not write vampires in exactly to my precise preference, but he does some really cool things otherwise. So I can't fault him for that. And I plan on reading more George Martin. I know some people have been doing this recently where they're like, we're going to read all of his non-Song of Ice and Fire stuff. And if that's a meme, like fine, whatever. But I honestly think that's a good thing to do, right? It's kind of hard to list George Martin as like a favorite author if you've just read, the 5 Game of Thrones books or Song of Ice and Fire books, Fire and Blood, and like the Dunk and Egg stories. It's like, okay, are you a Song of Ice and Fire fan or a George Martin fan? So people reading this, reading Windhaven, reading, Tough Voyaging, I think is a great thing. And having read this, I can now say, like, yeah, George Martin is a favorite author of mine. I think his stuff is really, really excellent. I'm going to be talking about 2 other books briefly here. I was mentioning rereads. I also just reread Fellowship of the Ring again, and I have a lot of thoughts about that. But that's another story. I'm going to say this is a book I listed as one of my anticipated releases for 2025. It was listed as a novel. Really, it's a novella, though. Cantos of Arcadia by Nicholas Kotar. So Nicholas Kotar, let me see if I got this right, I believe is an Orthodox deacon? I think that's correct. Nicholas or fans of his can correct me below. But he's known for his Ravensun series, which is fantasy. And this is a sci-fi novella that he wrote that is about AI and demons and religion and the end of the world in some really interesting ways. I think when Kotar was pitching this, he compared it to That Hideous Strength, which is immediately, you hooked me. He compared it to Canticle for Leibowitz and also Ursula K. Le Guin's books. And I think all 3 of those are excellent comparisons. I can't say a lot about this other than to say it is about the merging of man, machine, and demon all in one. So it's kind of blending, sci-fi and fantasy depending on how you look at it. But it blends those things in some really interesting ways. So if you're interested in this, I wouldn't bust your TBR to get to Cantos of Arcadia. I would say for people who are fans of That Hideous Strength, Canticle for Leibowitz, and Le Guin, they're probably more prone to like this rather than just picking this up because like, oh, Sam read it and liked it. See if you're a fan. Read those things first. See if you're a fan of them. And then check this out if you're interested in it, because I thoroughly enjoyed my time with it. It is a little on the short side. I think it could have been fleshed out to be 2 to 3 times the length that it is now. And yeah, I'm the guy who complains that many books are overwritten and overly long. So maybe I'm just a big hypocrite at the end of the day. I got 2 more things to talk about here. So we'll do one of them. This is another one of my anticipated releases for this year, although I didn't list it in my video because I just started reading him. This is The Familiar Spirit by DJ Butler and Aaron Michael Ritchie. So this is book 3 in his Cunning Man series. I'm very grateful that Dave Butler sent me an arc of it and signed it for me. So thank you, Dave. The Cunning Man books have been one of the highlights of my reading this year. This is the Mormon, essentially wizard in the Dust Bowl of Utah during the Great Depression, who helps people out using practical magic. Like your grandma with her essential oils, right? And so that comes in the form of prayers. It can come through the form of water divining or exorcism, calming a ghost, hexing a vehicle, all sorts of things. But he doesn't like using the word magic. He'll use phrases like charm. So obviously, I've talked about these Cunning Man books a good bit, both in my wrap-ups. I did a dedicated video to the first two, and then just recently, I had the absolute privilege of talking to Dave Butler specifically about these books and why they're so unique, why they're so different. And when I talk about this investigation of religion and fantasy in like one story, this is like the perfect example for this. And it's from a very atypical perspective where you get in a lot of fantasy, it'll be either like evil Catholic Church or it'll be like very like post-enlightenment neo-Protestant view of faith. This is basically an alternate faith tradition with something like the LDS Church that's being examined here. The Familiar Spirit is a good end to these three books. It is three, so it's technically a trilogy, but they're all standalone. I would recommend reading this one last, simply because there's a lot of questions about Hiram Woolley, the main character, and his family that get addressed here. There's a really freaky sequence involving ghosts in an insane asylum that's really, really good. Overall, I think book one is still probably my favorite. Maybe book two is. But this is a really solid entry as well. Butler and Richie do some really fun things because Hiram Woolley and his son, who almost is a co-lead in this book, it's like co-starring both of them. So this one, more so than all the others, is not just about Hiram Woolley, it's about Hiram and then, you know, his son as well, Michael, I believe, and them working together. But they do some really interesting things with that premise and them dealing with this ghost mystery in Mexico, where there's an LDS colony that they're assisting. So overall, if you're interested in the Cunning Man books, definitely check them out. I can't recommend them enough for people who are interested in them. And then we're gonna wrap up this this video by talking about my big project for the end of October and the beginning of November, which was finishing up a priority series for me this year, which is the second Apocalypse books by the one and only R. Scott Baker. So last year, when I said here are books that I want to read in 2025, one of the main books, I think it was the first or second book that I listed, was The Darkness That Comes Before. You know, I'd heard of these books, they looked interesting, I wanted to read, and I actually read The Darkness That Comes Before in December. So I didn't even wait till the year started. And then read Warrior Prophet, probably like January, February. And then Thousandfold Thought and Judging Eye back at the end of May and then beginning of June. And then I took a break and had a lot of questions of, do I want to go back to this series? Do I want to finish it up? There's 3 more books left. Where do we go from here? And finally decided that enough was enough. And it was time to put on my big boy pants and finish the Aspect Emperor books, so that last quartet from Baker. So that's the White Luck Warrior, the Great Ordeal, and then the last book, the Unholy Consult. And yeah, so I'm done with the series, and it is a very tricky series to talk about in a lot of ways. So one, because Baker is obviously very pessimistic. Many people would call him nihilist. I am not. And yet, so there's a certain element where it's like there's a worldview that he's presenting that I'm very much against. I mean, for Pete's sake, I've got like Lovecraft books behind me here. So I have no problem reading books and appreciating books from people who share worldviews that I don't. Like, I have no problem with that. And so Baker has that going for him. There's some really horrific things that he portrays, that he explores in these books, and yet when you're reading them, many times they don't strike you as just how dark they are, because there's almost a slow desensitizing to these things within the story that is done. Where you've got the Prince of Nothing trilogy, that's, you know, there's some pretty dark things that happen there, but then by the time you get to the end of the Unholy Consult, the place that he's taken you, it almost feels like a journey into hell in those last 4 books, where the place that he takes you as the reader and then also his characters by the end of this series. The Prince of Nothing trilogy, that first trilogy, is really about this holy war and how one individual, but then also other sub-powers sort of hijack it to their own means, to their own purposes. And so one of the questions that Baker is looking at is like, do we have free will? And like, you might think you're doing something for one reason, but how do you know that forces beyond your control and beyond your knowledge haven't hijacked it and are manipulating things all the way along? I mean, this is, honestly, is kind of in keeping with the Lovecraft sitting behind me here. There's a head on a pole behind you for the Baker fans. And then the second quartet is sort of about like, okay, so once the Holy War is over, now how do you rule an unholy empire? And how do you keep these dark Sauron, but even more evil, arguably, how do you keep these dark evil forces from retaking the world again? And to what lengths of evil do you need to go in order to fight for the good? And at what point do you get to where you say what we've done is so evil that it's no longer even worth fighting for the good anymore? So I don't know if it's a spoiler to give names of people who are in these last 4 Aspect Emperor books, but I will say, I guess I'll give that as a warning for people who don't want to hear anything. You can click off the video now. But these last 4 Aspect Emperor books deal a lot with Drusus a Commune, so the wizard dealing with the fallout of that first trilogy, trying to expose Anasarimber Kellis for being the fraud that he believes him to be, for being a prince of nothing. This man who is the Aspect Emperor, who has brought, these nations together and rules this empire with absolute power and an ungodly amount of supernatural force, reveal him for being a sham. But really, the heart and soul of this last quartet, and then obviously you've got Esmenet, which is, Kellis's wife, and a Commune's wife. But really, the heart of these books are the children. So many of the main characters are children of Esmenet and Kellis, and we get to see them. Obviously, Kelmomis and is the first one that comes to mind, but there's Moingus and others, some of the other children who are main characters. But then you've also got a kid of communes that becomes a main character, and so seeing the effects of people's actions on their children and how their children cannot control the circumstances that they've been placed into is once again another one of these anti-free will arguments that Baker is tapping on here. And I made this point before in some of my earlier videos on Baker, and I know some people really don't like my perspective on him, and that's okay. I understand. I call them hot takes for a reason. But it is very easy to present situations where it's like, see, checkmate. No free will within a constructed narrative where you as the author play God and get to lay in all the pieces, and your characters do not have free will because they are fictional characters that you are creating. They're not actual people with any type of autonomy. People will be like, oh, these, women or other people in the story, they need more agency. It's like, newsflash, nobody has agency. They're all fictional characters that R. Scott Baker has created. So I know some people don't like that. I think I've talked about before that I think Baker has a limiting, pessimistic view of the world where he will focus on negative aspects of humanity and surgically remove positive aspects. I had somebody on one of my last videos, and I appreciate the thoughts and the feedback. They disagreed. They said, no, I actually think that there are good examples of, we were talking about motherhood specifically, is that there are good examples of this in Baker, and went on to list like unnamed side characters that appear for a few paragraphs. And I take the point, I understand what's being explained there, but I think the fact that, especially on that motherhood point, that there are virtually no good mothers that are presented in the series, and I pick motherhood because it's easy to point to, but you could also look at something like fathers. There's no good examples of fatherhood in the series. And, many people have had bad dads, but guess what? There's a lot of people who have had good dads as well. If you're telling a story of an epic scale like this, and you're actually, and you're trying to present a full view of the human experience to one extent or another in this fictional world, and yet you have a very myopic and limited view of some of the fundamental aspects of humanity, that would make somebody ask some questions. I think there's valid criticism there. So, for example, if you look at something like the Wheel of Time, it's like, okay, is the Wheel of Time trying to represent all of the world? It's like, no, obviously not. But it's not something like Prince of Thorns either, where this is a very limited examination of one character and his experience. It's not a Clockwork Orange, It's not that. We're talking about lots of different people, lots of different families, lots of different characters and continents and cultures, right? But if you read Wheel of Time and every single like sister was a piece of garbage, like you had characters, whether men or women, and all of them just got like horribly treated by their sisters or like abused. Or even like sisters who would sell their siblings off into slavery or would try to murder their siblings. You look at it, and at a certain point, you'd go, well, gee, there's obviously family members who do that, and there's sisters who do that, and that's awful. But that is by no means an accurate reflection of what having a sister is like for a significant amount of people who have existed both now and in the past. And so that's the type of thing that I criticize Baker for, is his omission of elements of reality that disagree with his worldview. So when I've said things like, oh, it seems dishonest to me, I'm not meaning that he's deliberately trying to lie to the reader. It's more that he's removing things that are detracting from his vision of the world. Removing real facts, real aspects of the world. Now, once again, I know people are going to disagree with that. Hey, that's fine. That's fine. It's weird to say that you've enjoyed the second Apocalypse books, but there's a lot of things about them that I have enjoyed. I think R. Scott Baker's world building and his fantasy writing is second to none. I think his prose writing is great. I think he does a very good job at creating characters that I never would want to meet, characters that are not role models in any way, shape, or form. Characters that are very challenging, and yet you can't stop reading about them because they're so compelling and they're so interesting. I think he creates some really great villains. I mean, the Consul is like one of the most terrifying things that I've ever read about. And Nassarimber Kellis might be the most interesting fantasy character I've read about this year, maybe ever. I don't know. So I have a lot of praise for things that R. Scott Baker does. He does a lot of things like Christopher Rocchio, where he's mashing up a bunch of fantasy and sci-fi things. There's obviously a lot of Tolkien in his books. There's a lot of Stephen R. Donaldson. I'm not as familiar with Warhammer, at least not yet, but I've been told there's a lot of Warhammer in his books. And then obviously Dune and the Crusades. You know, those play a big part in it as well. Like, Dune plays a really big part in it. If you didn't get the point with Paul Atreides, you will not miss the point of a Nassarimber Kellis. There are parts of these books that I think are going to stick with me forever. And yeah, so I think for that, I'm glad that I read these books. But also, when I talk about being able to root for or enjoy following certain characters, even though they're not, you know, people that I would put up on a pedestal as like examples of moral virtue, some people really have an issue with that. You know, if there's characters like Jorgancraft, like Severian, like Paul Atreides, people who do horrible things, you know, they have a hard time reading about that. And, you know, maybe this would be a good series for history fans, right? Because the more that you read about history and the more horrific things that you see have happened and wars have happened in the past, the less horrific fiction becomes. You know, so you read some of the things that R. Scott Baker writes about, and it's like, okay, like what's new? You know, like this is to be expected in some ways. So, so yeah, maybe it's a question of context and where people are reading from when it comes to some of this stuff. I do find it really interesting that Baker has said in some places online that one of the points that he was trying to make is that of being against moral relativism, and that by the end of the Unholy Consult, the place that he takes the characters is so depraved in some ways that you can't walk out of it and say, well, it's really all a matter of perspective at the end of the day. Like, isn't morality just a social construct? And so it's really interesting to me that him presenting what is essentially an atheistic worldview in terms of the fantasy that he's constructing, yet comes out to a position of maybe not moral certainty, but certainly not one of moral ambiguity, and saying, like, well, it's all relative. I don't think you can walk away from these books and believe that at all. And I certainly don't. And so it's interesting how both he and Tolkien almost, and I said this when I was talking with Jimmy Nuts about this series, almost horseshoe, where they start at such radically opposite points, and they have such opposing worldviews, and yet some of their conclusions, not all of them by any means, but some of their conclusions are eerily similar. And you can argue about who has the better, you know, argument one way or another. Okay, that's fine. But yeah, that's the second Apocalypse. Man, what a series. I have a lot of thoughts on this, and might make another video about it. I'm not sure. My Baker opinions are probably some of the spicier ones that I have, and like I said, that's fine. If people disagree, you're welcome to tell me that I'm wrong, and explain why. So, but thank you guys for watching this. Yeah, some of the content may be changing up a little bit going forward here, but these are the books that I've been reading recently. There's some others that I read that I just don't have a whole lot to say, but these are the ones that I felt like I wanted to talk to people about. So, have you read any of these? Of the books that I read here, I would say that Fever Dream is probably my favorite. Although, like, The Great Ordeal by Baker is, like, right there. Um, Let me just briefly stop and rank the Second Apocalypse books, because I can, and, like, where else am I going to do this? So, The Warrior Prophet, and that's book 2, is still, like, my favorite. That is one of the best fantasy novels I've ever read, period. It's so good. And it's also weird to look back on the series and be like, remember when everyone was happy in The Warrior Prophet? Man, those were the good old days. It's like how miserable that book is, and yet that's the high point of the series. So I'd say Warrior Prophet. I would say The Great Ordeal and White Luck Warrior are tied there. I think those two are pretty equivalent. So Warrior Prophet, Great Ordeal, and White Luck Warrior. I would say The Darkness That Comes Before, and then The Unholy Consult, The Thousandfold Thought, and then Judging Eye is the bottom for me. Which is still, a very well-written book, still lots of good things there, but just, not my personal favorite as far as those go. It is really interesting how things at the end of the series recontextualize a lot of the opening parts of Prince of Nothing, and honestly make me want to go back and reread even just that first trilogy. So, and I know a lot of Baker fans say Aspect Emperor is, like, far and beyond better than Prince of Nothing. I honestly don't know. It's pretty neck and neck for me, but I might like Prince of Nothing more in some ways. I'm not totally sure. But yeah, so this is what I've been reading recently. I am currently reading this puppy right here, Shadows Upon Time, and I'm taking my time with it. I'm going slowly with it, and then I'm also rereading. This was accidental. I wasn't trying to, but I'm rereading Deathless Beast by Andrew Meredith, which is also excellent, very good. Even better on the reread, right? So, that's what I'm going through now. My TBR plans for the end of the year might not happen, but I'm trying to go a little bit more with what strikes my interest at the time. So, doing a mix of the mood reading and then also the TBR reads. But thank you all for watching this. We're going to have some channel read-alongs that'll be announced sometime soon here, and we'll go over that. So I should say, since I'm a part of this now, I'm going to plug this as well. I've had a few people ask me to start up a Discord, and some booktubers that are around my size have Discords, and there's like 10 people there, and that just seems sad to me. So I haven't really been interested in starting up a Discord of my own, but I was recently asked to join the Book Street Boys Discord. So that will be linked down below as well. If you want to contact me, if you want to share your thoughts on a video, or if you just want to hang out in a spot with a lot of other book fans, check out the Book Street Boys Discord down below. Yeah, everyone's welcome. I'm pretty inconsistent about my social media as far as getting in touch there, so if you want to reach out or if you have thoughts on anything, that's the best place to reach out to me. And when we do some read-alongs next year, I think we'll be going over a lot of sharing thoughts and updates and stuff there. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.